Cassie Jo's daughter was born on December 21, 1989, in the American town of Pocatello, Idaho. The locals were mostly religious and close-knit, accustomed to a quiet and measured life. As was often the case, none of them could have imagined that something so terrible could happen in the town. Cassie was a cheerful, kind, and responsible girl who never got into trouble. She was an excellent student, listened to her parents in everything she did, and helped her family whenever possible. In September 2006, Cassie, who was 16 at the time, agreed to look after her in-laws' house. Her Uncle Frank and his family were planning to go out of town for the weekend. Someone had to feed and walk the dogs while they were away, and Cassie had no problem agreeing. Even though their house was in the middle of nowhere, her parents weren't afraid to let Cassie go there alone for a few days. She had watched the house many times before in her uncle's absence, and with two Dobermans, it wasn't so scary to be in an empty house. Cassie had gone there on Friday, September 22nd, and was supposed to stay there until Sunday. In the evening, she called her mother and asked permission to call her boyfriend to watch a movie with him. But her mother said no. Then the girl said she would watch the movie alone and go to bed. The next day, Cassie did not contact her parents, but they did not care. The girl was responsible and independent, and what could have happened to her in their quiet little town? But the next day, Sunday, Cassie didn't come home at the appointed time, and that already alarmed her mother. After waiting a while, she got into her car and headed for Frank's house around noon. When she arrived, she saw that her brother and his family had already returned home. Only there was a heartbreaking sight waiting for them. Frank's 13-year-old daughter, who entered the house first, saw Cassie's lifeless body on the floor. Her parents immediately called an ambulance, but the girl had been dead for days. The police arrived at the scene and immediately realized that they were dealing with a murder. Everything pointed to the fact that Cassie had been stabbed repeatedly with a sharp object. Upon examining the crime scene, they noticed several potential leads. One of the basement windows had been broken, and the electrical panel door was ajar. Frank assured investigators that he always kept the fuse box closed, and Cassie was unlikely to go in there since she wasn't an electrician at all. In addition, the back door was unlocked. It was through this door that the perpetrator could have entered the house. The version of a robbery was quickly dismissed as there was nothing of value missing from the house. The perpetrator took neither money nor any belongings. Almost immediately, detectives encountered one suspicious moment. Both Dobermans were locked in a room on the second floor. A reasonable question arose. Who had locked them in there and why? According to Frank, his dogs would not obey a stranger and might have attacked him. This indicated that it was unlikely that the perpetrator would have taken the two adult Dobermans to the room and locked them in there. Much more logical was the theory that Cassie had locked the dogs herself, except why would you do that? The only possible explanation was that a friend had come over to her house on a Friday night, and she had to lock the Dobermans in her room to keep them from attacking her guests. The situation became more and more complicated. Based on the above, the killer could be someone Cassie knew well and had let into the house. The police, however, did not have to puzzle over this mystery, for the next significant clue emerged almost immediately. News of the murder quickly spread throughout the city, whose residents had never seen such a crime. Within hours of the discovery of the body, virtually everyone knew about it. While the detectives were working on the crime scene, a woman drove up to the house and said she had valuable information. It turned out to be Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham's mom. According to the woman, her son did go to Cassie's house at night to see a movie. The girl hid this fact from her mother because she had forbidden her to have guests. The police questioned Matt and his mother. According to them, his mother called him at about 10 p.m. and demanded that he go home, but Matt refused. He said that something strange was going on in the house. The lights had gone out several times, and a window had broken in an unexplained way. Cassie was frightened by what was happening, so the boy decided to stay with her, but his mother didn't believe the story. At this point, she thought Matt was simply making it all up to stay with Cassie. Then she decided to pick him up herself and drove to the house. Once there, the woman listened to Cassie's account of the oddities in the house, and what was happening no longer seemed fictitious to her. Then she suggested that the girl go away with them, but Cassie refused. For one thing, the electrical trouble and other strange things had already stopped. Second, she felt safe in the company of two Dobermans, deciding that there was really no cause for serious excitement. Matt and his mother left for home at about 11:30. The boy had no idea who might have killed the girl after they left. The detectives were in no hurry to take the young man and his mother at their word. At this point, the odds were not in Matt's favor at all. He was the last person to see the victim alive, and his mother's testimony might have been fabricated to protect her son. On the other hand, there was no evidence against him either. While Matt was under interrogation, medical examiners examined Cassie's body and drew some disturbing conclusions. The girl had been stabbed about 30 times with a sharp object. With a high probability that 2 different weapons had been used, this suggested that there might have been 2 assailants. In addition, Cassie had not been assaulted, which made the motive of the killers entirely unclear. All of this led the detectives to believe that Matt might have been the killer. They conceded that there might have been an argument between the couple during which the guy had taken up knives. That would have ruled out 2 versions at once: robbery and assault with intent to commit violence. Then investigators decided to press the guy and offered him a polygraph interview, and it paid off. Matt suddenly stated that he had actually withheld one detail from the police. According to him, that night, he called 2 mutual friends from the school where he went with Cassie. The guys' names were Brian Draper and Tori Adamsick. They were friends with Matt and Cassie, and that night, they agreed to come over to their house to watch a movie, except they didn't stay long because they found the movie boring. Shortly after they arrived, they said they would rather go to the local movie theater and left the house. As Matt was driving home with his mother, he called Tori and said he was on his way home. The guy had planned to meet his friends that evening, but they were already sitting in the movie theater. Matt explained to the detectives that he hadn't let his friends in for that very reason. They hadn't been in the house long and couldn't have had any useful information. Nevertheless, this confession closed the dog issue for the police. Cassie had locked them upstairs precisely because of Brian and Tori's arrival. Apparently, the Dobermans were familiar with Matt and were not aggressive towards him, but they reacted negatively to strangers. The police interviewed the guys, and they corroborated Matt's story completely. When they left Cassie's house, they went to the movie theater for a late-night showing, so they had an alibi. Detectives looked into their backgrounds and concluded that the guys most likely had nothing to do with what happened. Both did not have any problems with the law and were in good standing. However, the police still decided to check their alibis and went to the movie theater. To their surprise, the cashier stated that Brian and Tori had not been there that night. The girl who worked at the cashier's desk had gone to school with them and knew them both personally, so she was sure that the boys had not been to the movie theater. This was suspicious, but the detectives were in no hurry to accuse the 2 friends of murder. They didn't rule out that Brian and Tori had lied to cover up some minor infraction. Perhaps instead of going to the movie theater, they had gone out for a drink or 2 to spend time in other not-so-legal ways. But the cops couldn't ignore the false alibi either. They began to think of ways to get the guys to tell the truth. At one point, they even planned to start tapping their phones, only to find that it quickly became unnecessary. Detectives and city residents were in for a very unexpected twist. The very next day after Cassie's body was discovered, Tori Adamsick came to the police station with his parents, who forced him to tell the detectives a shocking story. Tori claimed that Brian had killed the girl and that he had unwittingly witnessed the crime. According to his story, that night, the boys simply decided to scare Cassie and make a practical joke of their own. Before leaving her uncle's house that night, they discreetly opened the back door. Next, Tori and Brian lied that they were headed to the movie theater, but instead parked their car across the street, put on plastic masks and dark clothing, and walked back. After entering the house through the back door, they proceeded with their prank. The guys broke a window and started turning the electricity on and off, thereby scaring Cassie and Matt. They hoped that the couple would go down to the basement to check the electrical panel, but that never happened. At about the same time, May's mother arrived at the house, and Tori and Brian fell silent. They heard the woman talk Cassie into going with them, then pick up her son and leave. As soon as the girl was left alone in the house, the boys started turning the electricity back on and off. They wanted Cassie to go down to the basement, but she was apparently afraid. Then Tori and Brian went upstairs from the basement and ran into the girl. At this point, according to Tori's story, his friend suddenly pulled out a knife and began stabbing Cassie, turning a harmless prank into a brutal murder. What happened shocked Tori, and he was afraid that Brian might kill him too. They left the crime scene and went to Tori's house, where they spent the night. All night long, the boy could not sleep and was afraid that Brian might attack his family. During this story, Tori cried, but the detectives thought what was happening was just a routine play. They knew from the medical examiner's report that 2 people had struck. So Adam's story made no sense. On the contrary, the detectives were well aware that if Brian had attacked Cassie, Tori had been in on it too. But they were in no hurry to accuse the guy of cheating. In the place of what they decided to play along with him, they needed physical evidence, so they reassured Adam Zach that he had nothing to fear. It was further explained to the boy that they could only put Brian in jail if Tori showed them where they had hidden the clothes and masks after the murder. This worked. Tori told them that immediately after what they had done, they drove out of town and buried all the stuff near Black Rock Canyon. The detectives drove him to the spot, and he gave them the exact location of the hiding place. Near where the evidence was buried, the police also noticed ashes from a campfire. Tori explained that he and Brian first wanted to burn the stuff, but it didn't work out. The thing is, they had tried to start the fire with hydrogen peroxide and found to their surprise that it didn't ignite. The police dug into the cache and got an unexpected surprise. They hoped they would only get their hands on clothes with traces of blood on them. But under the ground, they found much more useful evidence. The masks, gloves, and other articles of clothing were covered with blood. There were also 2 knives which the detectives immediately mistook for murder weapons. There was also a partially charred piece of paper on which Adam Zach's handwriting detailed how he and Brian had killed Cassie. All of this might have been enough to arrest both suspects, but above her hold lay perhaps the most gruesome piece of evidence. Investigators discovered a videotape, the contents of which shocked them. Tori and Brian had recorded what they called an appeal to would-be serial killers. In it, the boys revealed that they were planning to kill 2 of their friends, Cassie and Matt. They outlined their plan and wished good luck to all the other killers. The tape also contained footage from the day of the murder. Tori and Brian did some sort of interview with Cassie and Matt in the school hallway, then once again announced on camera that they were going to kill them. But the creepiest part came next. The next footage was taken after the murders when the guys were driving in the car to get rid of the evidence. They were laughing, shouting, and cheering. Tori and Brian couldn't hide their excitement and were amazed at how easy it was for them to take someone's life. Of course, with such a set of evidence, Adam Zach could no longer pretend to be an innocent victim. It was obvious to the cops that he was directly involved in the murder, and the guy in tears admitted that he had actually stabbed Cassie several times. In the end, both perpetrators were arrested, but the cops had another important discovery waiting for them. They noticed that on the tape, Brian was constantly writing something down in a notebook. The detective searched his room and found it carefully hidden from view. The notebook contained a list of things to buy before the murder, but what followed was something really creepy, a list of 20 names. It turned out that the perpetrators were going to kill 20 people over the next 2 years, pausing for a month at a time. Among them were friends and teachers, and even relatives of Tori and Brian. The police talked to all the people on the list, and it came as a real shock to them. They all thought they were on good terms with the people who were actually going to kill them. Once under arrest, the guys began to shift the blame onto each other in the hope of avoiding punishment. Despite the fact that both perpetrators were 16 years old, they were tried as adults. The trials began in 2007 and were conducted separately. Then it was revealed that Tori and Brian had been inspired to kill by the cult movie Scream, and even tried to imitate the masked maniac. This explained their choice of weapons and attempts to frighten the victim with a blackout. In addition, they idolized serial and mass murderers such as Ted Bundy or the Columbine rifleman. In other words, their only motive was to kill, and they wanted to turn it all into a show. The boys expected that after all the murders they had committed, they would become legends and make history. In spite of all that, medical experts declared them sane, so they should not have been indulged by the court. On April 17, 2007, Brian Draper was found guilty of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. On June 8, Tori Adams Act was found guilty of the same charges. Both were sentenced to life without parole and 30 years on top of each for conspiracy. Adams Act's family resented such a harsh sentence. They felt that the court should have imposed a more lenient sentence because their son had led the detectives to the evidence. However, the judge was well aware that no credit was due to Tori himself. The boy was just scared and tried to blame it on his buddy, and that does not entitle him to any leniency. In the years that followed, Tori and Brian appealed repeatedly trying to get their sentences reduced, but each time they were turned down. Most likely, the two will never get out of prison again unless the U.S. authorities decide to cut them some slack. What we have in the end, undoubtedly, Tori and Brian are the most real psychopaths, but they were fully aware of what they were doing. They started preparing for the murders long before the attack on Cassie, trying to think through every move. It was partly fortunate for the police that the two maniacs were not brilliantly intelligent. They didn't even think about the fact that their fake alibis could be checked in a few minutes, and that would make them prime suspects right away. Now they continue to serve their sentences in the same prison, only now, they hate each other for their mutual attempts to blame each other. Cassie's family has never been able to return to a normal life after all this horror. Frank's 13-year-old daughter, who first discovered Cassie's body, later tried to end her life. Frank and his family were also forced to move out of the house because no one else could be there. Even though the police department sent an expert to clean up the crime scene, the residents of the house never went in there again, except to get their belongings. Frank had been trying to sell it for years, but couldn't find any buyers. Everyone knew the history of the house and didn't want to live there. For Cass's mother, the only consolation was the fact that the killers had been caught and sent to jail, even though it wouldn't bring her daughter back. Share your opinion on the story in the comments.